are usually pretty misguided, because they usually don't even redistribute all that effectively, because often the rich eat more corn and consume more oil, and you get this huge overconsumption of some commodity rather than just giving money directly to poor people. Now, as a counter-argument, in some poor countries it may be really hard to figure out what someone's income is and to know whether someone's poor. And that may make it difficult to implement that more efficient system. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
So with all this kind of talking about redistribution, is this all assuming that there is some Pareto efficient allocation that we're attempting to get to?
Well, it's not Pareto efficient. It's just some one Pareto efficient.
Right.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of the idea lying behind this. A lot of people in society don't want the rich to have too much, and the question is how do we achieve that goal? Okay. And we'll talk more about how we want to try to achieve that goal in a later lecture. I think it's lecture 14
but
or something.
On its own, you'll still get a Pareto efficient allocation, but we just start looking for distribution to get a different one?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends how you define it. I mean, we'll talk later about a reason why distributing more to the poor might be actually the only Pareto efficient allocation, because people might want insurance against the risks they face in their life, and that may be a way of providing them with that insurance. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay. There are some cases, though, when it can make sense to subsidize particular goods. So in particular, we know that taxing people's income reduces the amount they want to work. So it might be a really good idea to put tax on vacations, or on anything that goes along with not working that hard. Because things that go along with not working that hard are going, if you tax those and people reduce their consumption of those, then they're going to want to work harder. So one example of that is rather than giving money out to the poor, it might make sense to give out free education. Because education is not very useful if you're just planning to relax for the rest of your life, right? It's most useful if you're planning to work. And so education might be a really good way to redistribute. More generally, redistributing in ways that make people more productive members of society is desirable, and taxing them in ways that make them more productive members of society is valuable. Okay. Now, I just pointed out to you why the second fundamental welfare theorem is actually not so free market after all. And I want to point out why also the first fundamental welfare theorem is not so free market, right? So the usual interpretation of the first fundamental welfare theorem, I don't know if this is what you guys learned in last term or not, is the market does everything efficiently, so just leave it alone, right? But this is not always how this theorem has been seen. In fact, socialists argued something very different. What did socialists argue from the Hayek article was the right interpretation of the fundamental welfare theorem?
So this planner gains all the information from the market.
Yeah.
And according to that information, he allocates.
Yeah, so why did they say that the first fundamental welfare theorem didn't favor the market?
Because Pareto efficiency can be achieved by
a planner as well. Yeah, that's right. Because, a planner can just run one of these artificial markets, like that financial market I was describing, or like Al Roth's markets, right? And markets in practice suffer from lots of imperfections. They're complicated for people to operate in. Firms tend to get market power. There are externalities, things that we'll be studying for the rest of the course. Socialism would really be more efficient because it would do the thing that a true market would do. It would actually implement the optimal allocation. It could run a little fake market inside of itself, and you could just redistribute people's resources so you could get fairness and efficiency, right? So really what the welfare theorems warn against is not socialism. They just warn against stupid local deviations from either the market or socialism, right? So don't subsidize things as a way of redistribution. Just take money away from people and send them to a labor camp if they don't work hard enough as a form of redistribution, right? So in many ways, if you think of all those non-market markets that I was talking about before, those are all cases where we were using a centralized system rather than a decentralized market get all the advantages of a market, right? So the welfare theorems do not favor capitalism or the market. So Hayek then tried to identify what actually was good about the market. And Jackson, what did Hayek say was valuable about the market?
Essentially, he said that without the market, there's no way to get all the information together and make the correct decision without just a bafflingly complex decision making.
Yeah, exactly. So von Mises and Hayek said that for a planner to make decisions, they need information. And it's very hard for them to get that information without prices. So imagine that we try to build a railroad, right? And we have to decide whether we're going to go through a mountain or around the mountain, right? And it might require a lot more labor to go through the mountain and maybe different raw materials, but it might be quicker than going around the mountain. So the question is, how, without knowing the price that people are willing to pay for going, a shorter trip versus the price of labor and these other resources, do we figure out which one we should do? You'd have to know all the other things that determine those if you don't have the prices available, right? So you need to do some huge calculation. So in a price system, all you need to know is a few prices. And every individual person can incorporate their local knowledge into those prices by just acting in some local way. Like, if they know that it's cheaper to do this thing than that thing, they can do that and maybe earn some monopoly profits off of being the only person who does that for a short period of time. That's the beauty of the market, is it allows each person to get some value from just incorporating their little local piece of information. So the market, in that conception, is really an information aggregator. So the story that I most like about this is that nobody knows how to make a pencil, right? There's someone who knows how to mine graphite. There's someone else who knows how to chop down graphite into ways it can be transported. There's someone else who knows how to transport the graphite. There's someone else who knows how to cut down the trees. And someone else who knows how to transport the trees. And someone else who knows how to, cut the trees into the things that go around the graphite. But nobody knows how to make the whole pencil, right? So thus, if market failures are the main cost of markets relative to socialism, delegation is its main benefit. If individuals have information the government doesn't, then there's a value in allowing the market to function despite its problems. And there are trade-offs that show up in each area that we think about in economics when we talk about things being market versus government or socialism that relate to how much information we think people have. So, Clémence, given our earlier discussion, do you think the trade-off between sort of socialistic or capitalistic redistribution of income is, and how does that relate to the information people have? Well, if we had all the information, right, we could redistribute costlessly, as we were saying before. So when we don't know everyone's potential income, right, what is the trade-off that we then face between redistributing more and redistributing less? Well, if we redistribute more, what happens? The question? So if we redistribute more, that means like we try to move more money from the rich people to the poor people, right? We know we could do that for free if we knew everyone's potential income. It wouldn't have any efficiency cost. But if we don't know everyone's potential income, what's the loss that we have if we try to move more money from the rich to the poor?
Well, it can be inefficient because we can take money from somewhere that won't have this money in the future.
So, but why would that be inefficient?
It's like debt.
Well, the key thing is that if we take money from people with high income, they're not going to want to work as hard, right? And so if we don't know what people's potential income are, and we actually have to tax their actual income, then we have this trade-off between capitalism, which lets people just keep all their money but gets more total production, and socialism, which redistributes it more but produces less because it doesn't give people as many incentives to work. That is what you really hear people talk about when they're thinking about capitalism versus socialism. But all that comes from the private information that people have. If people didn't have this information about how productive they were that was better than what the government had, right, then you could just tax people based on their potential income, right? A similar issue arises in regulation when we study it. So we'd like to regulate companies so companies don't make so much profit, so we keep prices down, so we don't have monopoly distortions. We'll talk about that later in the course. But the problem is that usually companies know what their costs are better than the government does. And if we try to regulate prices down, the companies won't have as much incentive to improve their production processes to bring prices down, or they won't have as much of an incentive. They might be forced out of business if you try to regulate prices down too low. Another issue is prizes versus patents. Patents are really inefficient because they exclude people from using a product that would be valuable to them, right? But if we tried to instead reward people by just giving them prizes, the government would have to know exactly how valuable any product was and not let the market tell it that. So again, if we didn't have that people knew better what the demand for their product was likely to be than what the government was able to do, then it would be best to just give people prizes. But we're forced to accept the distortions that come with having these patents and having prices above cost because the government doesn't know how valuable the products are. Similar issues arise if we try to think, should we, like the FDA, just say there's certain products that are okay or certain products that are bad, or should we give lots of detailed information to consumers like we do in most financial situations where you get a giant document telling you all the properties of the fund? Well, it depends on whether the consumer consumers are very heterogeneous and they know exactly what they want and want to read through this giant document to figure out exactly the right thing for them, or whether all consumers are pretty similar, in which case just labeling something as good or bad is much more effective. So who has the information? Whether the central authority is better able to determine whether certain treatments are good or bad, or whether the individual knows their particular situation and is able to figure out which is better, is what determines how much information, whether you want to give very blunt information to the consumers or very rich information, which it takes them longer to determine. So throughout the rest of the course, yeah, David?
I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
It seems like most of this is based on the assumption that the consumer would know his or her own preferences given the information that's available to him or her.
No, I don't think that that's true. I think that that's exactly what I'm saying is not true.
Right,
so
okay.
What I'm saying is that if the consumer knows all these preferences and it's easy for them to figure out all the collective knowledge and so forth, then we want to delegate a lot to the consumers.
Right.
But on the other hand, if it requires a lot of study and thought and central determination to figure out what the consumers would want, even given their thing, then it's going to be much better to centralize the process, right? So like, for example, that might seem a little bit weird, but think about Netflix or Google, right? You could say, oh, give the consumer complete choice. They can choose whatever website they want to go to. Of the tens of or hundreds of trillions of websites that exist out there. Well, none of us want that, right? We just want to tell them something very simple about us, like I'm looking for a used car. And then Google will figure out what the best thing for me to look at is, using all the data that it has, right? Or Netflix, you could just say, well, I want to have just choice over all the movies, but of course you don't. What you want is Netflix to tell you what movie you're going to like, right? Because it would be such a huge amount of work for you to figure out what your preference is, right? So on the other hand, there's some other cases where we don't really want some centralized thing to tell us because, maybe in